Hi guys, Miss Francis here to continue our discussion about ecosystems, and we're going to focus on community dynamics and look at how the feeding relationships determine the trophic structure of a community, where transfers of energy from photosynthetic organisms through herbivores, through carnivores. It's called the food chain. And when multiple food chains are linked together, which is the case in any ecosystem, we refer to that as a food web. So Charles Elton was the first one who pointed out that the length of a food chain is usually 4 or 5 links, and he called each one of these links, so to speak, a trophic level. And he was the one who also recognized that food chains aren't isolated, but connected together in webs. So if we look here, you're going to have your first trophic level. Your first trophic level are your primary producers, your photosynthetic organisms, your autotrophs. They make their own energy. Then you've got your second trophic level, which contains your primary consumers. These are the first organisms within a food chain that must obtain their food. They are heterotrophs. They can't make their own food, and they're herbivores because they eat photosynthetic organisms. Then you've got your secondary, your tertiary, and your quaternary consumers. Again, these are all heterotrophs. They must obtain their food, and this is where you start seeing carnivores and even omnivores. Food webs show who eat whom in a community, where the arrow points in the direction of the flow of energy. So if we look at the base of our food web down here, you've got the algae. Algae are the producers, they're autotrophs, they contain the most energy, they contain the most biomass, which we'll get to in a second. Then you'll see the second level, which are your primary consumers, your heterotrophs, your herbivores. Those are represented by your krill. Then you've got your secondary consumers, your tertiary consumers, your quaternary consumers, which can also be called your apex predators. But each one of these organisms is connected by an arrow, where that arrow is showing the direction of the flow of energy. So like we said, autotrophs are the primary producers. Heterotrophs are at the trophic levels above the primary producers. They depend on those primary producers' photosynthetic output. Then you've got primary, secondary, and tertiary consumers. What we haven't mentioned is another important group of heterotrophs, the detrivores or the decomposers. And these organisms are actually going to be found at every single trophic level. Food chains can also be represented as food pyramids, where we call it the pyramid of energy. And it's in a pyramid shape because the largest part is at the bottom, representing the most energy, whereas the smallest part is at the top, which represents the least amount of energy. So energy is transferred ultimately from the sun to the producers onto the primary, secondary, and tertiary consumers. But only 10% of that energy is transferred to the next level because most of the energy is used for that organism's metabolism, or it's lost as heat at each level. So here's just a nice flow chart showing that flow of energy. And here's an interesting chart because it visually shows how only 10% of energy, which is measured in joules, gets passed on to each successive trophic level. So biomass. Biomass is the total area that organisms occupy, where producers have the greatest biomass at the bottom of the pyramid. Again, the pyramid shape is used because it's largest at the bottom and narrowest at the top. So most biomass pyramids narrow sharply from the primary producers all the way up to your apex predators or your top level carnivores because those energy transfers are insufficient. The pyramid of numbers show how the number of individuals present in each trophic level also decreases from producer to each level of consumer. Now, decomposition connects all trophic levels. The organisms that feed as detrivores are that major link between the trophic levels. And what they do is return nutrients back into the ecosystem. The ecosystem's main decomposers are fungi and prokaryotes